On regulation, I will formulate a rule which says that for every one new regulation, 2 old regulations must be eliminated. So important.
For months as a presidential candidate, Donald Trump vowed that if elected, he would dismantle the very complex law known as Dodd-Frank, the Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform and Consumer Protection Act, as it's formally known. That's the sweeping financial industry reform that President Obama signed in the wake of the 2008 financial crisis. We asked Bloomberg financial regulations reporter Elizabeth Dexheimer to give us a quick rundown on what it would take to repeal Dodd-Frank on Capitol Hill this year.
For Wall Street and financial regulation, Donald Trump continues to be the ultimate wild card. Donald Trump has called for cutting regulations across the board. That includes Dodd-Frank. Broadly, that is something that the industry would like to see. However, on the campaign trail, as part of the populist message that he ran on, he had also called for reinstating the Glass-Steagall Act, which is a law that separates investment and commercial banking and would essentially force the biggest U.S. banks to break up. That is something that is not consistent with what a lot of Republicans in Congress would like to see, and certainly what the biggest U.S. banks and much of Wall Street would like to see. In the House, on the House Financial Services Committee, Jeb Hensarling, who is the chairman, is a key player and has already proposed some legislation that would overhaul Dodd-Frank. That is seen largely as a blueprint for what the House will propose around this. A big wild card is getting support from Democrats in the Senate. In order to avoid filibuster rules, you're going to need at least 8 Democratic senators to agree to pass legislation, unless Republicans decide to take a much more aggressive stand and do it through some sort of like a budget bill or a mandatory spending bill. We're going to see likely a bill introduced in the House, waiting to hear what Republicans in the Senate craft. But this is a long conversation. This is something that's going to play out over many months.
Elizabeth joins us now to talk more about the likelihood and implications of repealing Dodd-Frank. Also with us is Bloomberg B&A legal editor Rob Tricchinelli. Thank you both for joining us. Rob, let me ask you first, are there divisions within the Republican Party on Capitol Hill about what should be done with Dodd-Frank? And if so, what are they?
There aren't that many divisions. The key thing to watch here, though, in the coming months is what the Senate does. I mean, we alluded to that in the clip just now, Elizabeth did, but previous Republican legislative efforts have not gone as far on Dodd-Frank as the Jeb Hensarling approach. And now you have a new Senate Banking Committee chairman, guy from Ohio named Mike Crapo, and he likes to do things in a bipartisan way whenever possible. There may be some tension there, but the Senate still is pretty much a wild card on what Republicans want to do with Dodd-Frank.
Elizabeth, there's a lot of contradictions and seeming contradictions in Donald Trump and what he talks about. You would think that allowing Wall Street to have more power would be against a populist image. Do members of Congress, Republican members of Congress, fear at all a backlash in repealing or fundamentally scaling back Dodd-Frank?
It's definitely a long-term political risk. As you said, Trump ran on this populist economic message that including bashing big banks, that included criticizing Hillary Clinton's ties to Goldman Sachs. And this is something that the optics of this debate and whether or not Republicans are being seen as helping and giving a hand to Wall Street is something that in the long term could backfire.
So Elizabeth, who's going to be just staying with you, who's going to be the voice for this argument? It's a tricky argument to make, right? I mean, in a lot of cases where Trump wants to deregulate, businesses broadly for it, people don't like red tape. Wall Street is, as you just said, not super popular. So who in the administration? Is it Steve Mnuchin? Is it Gary Cohn? Who becomes the public voice for this as the argument unfolds on the Trump side?
It's a great question, and you mentioned Cohn, you mentioned Mnuchin. Trump is still filling a lot of these economic positions, and so particularly looking at the Fed, for example, is going to help dictate sort of who is taking the lead on this. Most likely, the administration is going to look to Congress for an example of sort of how to move forward with this. Right now, it's Jeb Hensarling who, in the House, he is close to Mike Pence and was an early supporter of Donald Trump. He also has the legislation already ready to go. It passed in the previous Congress, and he is expected to roll out a new version of that in the coming weeks. But quite frankly, it remains to be seen. Those are a lot of questions.
Rob, this was a hard bill to get passed. It was really complicated, even in the context of the financial crisis, even at a time when Wall Street was at its least popular state back in 2009, 2010. So what are the things that could cause this to come undone? The biggest hurdles that Donald Trump, his administration, and Republicans are going to have to overcome in order to actually enact a fundamental unwinding of Dodd-Frank?
The first one that comes to mind is the thresholds in the Senate. Under the ordinary legislative process, you'd need 60 votes to overcome that filibuster. And while there is a possibility that some of Dodd-Frank can get undone through this reconciliation process, that only works with things that affect spending. And Dodd-Frank is huge. It's just, it affects so many different areas of financial legislation that only some of it can be done with that 51 majority that reconciliation needs. You're going to need 60 votes in the Senate unless there's a huge change in how the majority runs things over there. So look for maybe some red state Democrats who are up for re-election in 2018 in the Senate, maybe they'll go along with some of this Dodd-Frank changing. But you've heard Chuck Schumer, the incoming leader of Senate Democrats, say that they're going to fight tooth and nail to stop Dodd-Frank changes and that he's got the votes to stop it. That's the biggest hurdle right there at the Senate.
Elizabeth, we've all said big, complicated, sprawling. Say I'm a consumer and I'm hearing that Washington's thinking of changing Dodd-Frank. What are the things that might change that would actually affect consumers directly?
So the first big question is the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau and the leadership and structure and really its future. It's a complicated debate in of itself, but that could certainly have implications for rules that the Bureau is currently considering, such as those around payday lenders and some mortgage rules, for example. Those kind of remain in limbo. Also, sort of, the enforcement actions that the Bureau could take. So I would really say the actions and the leadership around the CFPB is first and foremost. Okay. Otherwise, though, this is a multi-month-long debate. Nothing is going to change overnight. I'm not asking you guys to predict. This is a tough thing, and we don't know. This is in the stew with everything else. But Rob first, then Elizabeth. If this is done, is this a 2017 signed into law proposition, or does this go into 2018?
The big indicator that we've heard now is just this week, Jeb Hensarling, who we were talking about, he said the changes are going to get done this year. That's his prediction. He's sort of gone out there the most out of anybody to put a timeline on it. So that's what I'll cite.
Elizabeth, is it doable in this calendar year?
I think that there are some ambitious Republicans, including Jeb Hensarling, but I would say that this stretches out for quite a long time. First and foremost, they're going to be competing. Anyone that's advocating for changes to Dodd-Frank is going to be competing with an aggressive legislative agenda. There are a lot of other items that Congress is going to have to tackle first.
Yeah, including tax reform with a big, heavy overlap on interested players. Rob Tricchinelli, Elizabeth Dexheimer, thank you both.